Hi there, I'm Paul Burgess, and today I want to talk to you about the ID as it relates to communication, and particularly from the perspective of a leader. So I've put together some thoughts around what I'd call the ABC of communication. A standing for authenticity, which is your authenticity. B is for your bias, and C is for the community that's going to be impacted by your communication. So let's talk about authenticity. What I mean there is, where are you at in terms of your true beliefs around that communication? Are you in stride with it? Like if you're driven to verify, do you really believe this is the right thing to be sharing? If you're driven to authenticate, do you think this is useful? Do you think this is something that's going to actually make a tangible difference? If it's just something that you've got to do to appease somebody else, or you don't really believe in it, or you're doing it out of some level of obligation, people can tell that. There's not that real conviction and congruence behind it. And I think there's a lot of times when people communicate things out of responsibility, out of obligation. And if they'd have actually thought first, how do I get engaged in this authentically? It would make a massive difference to the way their communication lands and how people engage with it and run with it afterwards. B is about your bias. Now, every person who, everyone has an ID, and every ID has its bias. It's natural for that person to operate a certain way. The subtle point I wanted to convey today was that often when you're trying to open up a dialogue and have a real conversation with a person, your own bias can actually block that conversation or communication from happening and going to a real level. So say, for example, I ask someone the question, what's the best thing about working here at LinkUp, for example? If that person I'm talking to is an avoid verify, they don't even think in terms of the best thing. That's the way a verifier thinks, about singling things down to one, to get it right, to a single answer. So when a person who hasn't got that mindset now is being asked to think like that, it's too awkward and they can't really get into it. Now that's only one example of one bias. There are other examples for verifiers and the same for the other instincts. But I think if you can become aware of how your way of conversing, even for somebody who's really quick and pacey and off the cuff and excited, for someone who's not like that, who's much more subdued and conservative and needs time to do things properly. So if you say, come on, let's go and have a coffee and we'll have a good talk about that issue that's really been on your mind, that can sound really superficial and way too casual for someone who wants to treat it much more seriously. And it's just the nature of the bias. So when you go and think you're having a real conversation, that person's not going to open up to you if they don't feel it's being set up in a way that works for them. Becoming aware of that, I think, is a really huge skill and gives you a huge advantage as a leader when you're communicating. And the third area was around community. And by community, I mean, think about who are all the people that are going to be impacted by your communication. You might send an email or a voicemail to one person, but depending on how emotional that is for them or how supportive and encouraging it is for them, it's highly unlikely that that voicemail or email or document stays just with them. It's when you sit back and think about it, it's often quite obvious that they would have forwarded that on to somebody else. And often you can even predict who that person might have been. Might be a spouse, might be a colleague, might be their boss. But if you think about it, you often can see that that direct communication you had is actually going to go to other people who are actually going to be affected or have some influence and effect on the person that you were originally communicating with. If you take that into account, I think you'd be much more effective in your overall communication. So there's some thoughts around the ABC of communication and ID. Thanks for listening.